hopefully everyone's here to learn a little bit about sociocracy for a consultant. And I think I'll be learning as well, because I hope there's be some really interesting dialogue, questions, feedback. That'd be really useful. So hopefully it'll be a very bi-directional session. In terms of framing, sociocracy is really interesting to me. And it's not just interesting as an organizational paradigm, but there's also some really interesting tools there that I feel can be used outside of sociocracy in other contexts that can drive really positive effects. And one of the ones that I feel very passionate about is consulting. I'm Simon, and I'm obviously a recovering consultant, and that's why I particularly feel that way. Please, as I go along, just chime in, just speak up. I can't see you all, so if you have any questions, just jump in. If you can't hear me or something, just say, don't feel shy. Very quickly, one thing that I always find really useful when I'm listening to speakers is understanding the lens through which they see the world, because it helps me understand why they think the way they do. And for me, my background's primarily technical. I started as a software developer, and then I did an MBA, and then since then I found that my career has been a really interesting and varied one. More recently being a visiting lecturer in computer science, and soon a vagrant or a bum, looking for my next challenge. But just in case that helps you understand how I see the world, is probably more from a technical perspective. More recently, what I found really interesting is not just helping organizations be more effective from a technical side, but also from a people side, which has really led to my interest in sociocracy. Everything in this deck is my own view on the world. And I hope as we go through, you'll chime in with questions and you'll share your own view. Maybe you'll have different views, maybe you'll have questions. Please just speak up. I'm really interested to learn from you. So these are the three things that I was really interested in talking about. Firstly, nurturing healthy client relationships. Secondly, resolving conflict. And finally, informed distributed decision-making. That's a bit of a mouthful. Before we get started, any questions or any shout-outs? No? Okay, cool. So the first thing I wanted to talk about was nurturing healthy client relationships. Most of these slides have a little bit of a story to them. But before I talk about the story for this slide, let me just kind of talk a little bit about context. So consultants have this really interesting, as you probably know, I know a number of you consultants have this really interesting balance where for them to deliver really nice outcomes for the client, they need to work with the client very closely, because if they don't, firstly, they're probably going to generate the wrong outcome. And secondly, any result that they do help generate is probably going to leave with them out as they walk out the door. It's not going to be sustainable. It's not going to be sticky. And so really that means for consultancies or consultants to be successful, they need to work really hand in hand with the clients. But from the other perspective, when a consultant comes through your door, I don't know about you, but I feel very pessimistic about them. I feel very skeptical and worried about, we're paying these guys to come in, but I don't know anything about them. And they're all wearing suits and they look kind of funny. They've got funny haircuts. I'm not sure if I trust them. And it's, as a consultant, how can you overcome that and really help nurture that relationship if that relationship is what's going to generate that more positive outcome? So now I'm going to talk about story. So I had this really interesting engagement with a client where I was helping them basically create they wanted to land a new offshore office and set some teams up in there. That was the kind of the aim of the engagement. And when I first talked to the client, I was quite surprised because they were a little bit more prickly, a little bit more difficult to interact with than I had expected. And I wasn't sure why. And in that situation, a consultant, I find, generally has three options. The first option is become defensive. And that generally isn't good for the client. It's not good for the consultant. It normally escalates. The second option is to ignore it. And just to hope that as you do work together, as you show them what you're capable of, that trust will build up and any negativity or any difficulty in conversing will just go away. So it's kind of just hoping for the best. And the final one is empathy. And that's really saying, okay, well, I'm curious. I'm curious to understand why they're behaving that way and why they feel that way. And generally, that's something that I'm quite shy about, especially in engagement, because that makes me anxious. I'm not really, you're entering a conversation and you don't know what's going to come out. It might be something I don't want to hear or I'm not ready to hear. It might be them just not liking me and me as an individual. It might be that there's things that they don't like that are outside of my control. And so if you start having that conversation, it can be quite scary. In that situation, I feel very blessed that it went down that third route with, regardless. I didn't guide it down that route. We just went down the empathy route. And I think a lot of the reason for that was we'd established a shared purpose. Up until that point, the actions that I demonstrated showed that my interests in getting their new office online was perhaps even more passionate than their own. And so it naturally built that trust, so that when we got to that conversation that was quite difficult, it naturally went down that route of empathy and they started opening up to me. And I found something very interesting. I found that they had had a number of consultants come in to try and open that office for them and had not achieved results and disappeared. And so now I know why they were feeling the way they did. They were feeling frustrated because they'd invested all this time in consultants coming in to try and help them, give them the information they need, and then they just disappeared. And so I completely understood. And what that meant was I then approached the engagement very slightly differently. It meant that all the way through I was trying to demonstrate that I wasn't going to run away and that I was responsible and accountable for any progress or lack of. So I was communicating in the morning and evening, and when something wasn't going as well as I wanted, I told them so they wouldn't have to come find me. I told them and I said, this isn't going well. This is what I'm doing about it, but I just want to make you aware. And over a period of 3 or 4 weeks, I found that the engagement became really interesting. We became friends. There was a lot of camaraderie where they were actually starting to take work away from me and saying, hey, well, actually, you know what? I can do this much more quickly and more effectively than you because I know the organization. If you do this, I'll do that. And it became this really nice, fruitful relationship as a result. Anyway, so coming back to sociocracy, the reason I wanted to talk about this was sociocracy and nonviolent communication gave me an understanding of how important empathy is, but it also gave me confidence in finding a way of carefully understanding why people are behaving the way they are and why people are feeling the way they are. And that just became so important in how I operated as a consultant because it builds trust and also builds an understanding, which is important if you want to deliver really good outcomes. Any questions? I talked a lot. Okay, cool. The second thing I wanted to talk about was one that I found even more interesting because there's a few more dimensions of sociocracy in here. So we had this, I'm going to go straight into the story. I like reminiscing. So the story for this one was we were working in partnership with another consultancy to help a client. And 3 weeks after the engagement had begun, we were too busy conflicting with the other consultancy to generate anything useful to the client. What I was concerned about was this was the first engagement of potentially many with our clients. And if we didn't find a way of working together, we'd not only lose out on work, but we'd lose out on some really interesting and meaningful partnerships. And that was going to be fun. As a neutral party, someone who hadn't been involved in the project to date, I was asked to run a conflict resolution workshop where we got our colleagues from the other consultancy into a room with my colleagues from our consultancy. Yeah, so we invited them over to our office and we were going to have them all in a room where we were going to discuss all our feelings and get all cuddly. So where sociocracy came in was the first thing that I did was, as these ladies and gentlemen came from the other consultancy, I kind of did an implicit check-in with them because they were coming to our native land and they were, a lot of them I hadn't met and I was facilitating, and I wanted them to feel comfortable and I wanted to understand how they felt so that as they entered that room, they would feel psychologically safe. So I did this implicit check-in with everyone as they arrived. It's probably it's not, check-in's probably not the right word. I'm probably misusing it a little bit, but it was really nice to get them to open up to me before we entered that room together for that confrontation. The second thing that I did was a round. So as soon as everyone was in the room, I did a round. And that was a cathartic round, as I like to call it, where I asked everyone, one after the other, to express a positive feeling they were feeling about the situation, a negative feeling. And the reason that I do that was for them to be able to let out their frustrations, so that when we moved on to the next stage, there was more of a constructive air in the room as opposed to just pent up feelings. But even doing that, I found something really interesting. Everyone was feeling pretty much the same two feelings. One was frustration, because they really wanted to move forward in this project, but they couldn't. They were just conflicting all the time. And the second one was excitement. Everyone was really excited about the project, and they really wanted to do this well because the client was really cool and the project was really cool and they really believed in it. And what was really interesting was because everyone felt the same way, that generated a shared purpose. Everyone wanted to resolve this, and everyone was really wanted to get on with this project. So I'm just checking the time. Cool. And so that really quickly aligned everyone in the room, just by chance at the very beginning of that workshop. I'm going to skip through bits of the workshop, but that aren't really as relevant. But what people did next was they went away with Post-its individually and tried to describe what a well-functioning team looks like. What are the characteristics and behaviors of a well-functioning team? And that kind of created them a vision for where they wanted to get to. In doing that, we started to look at what each individual had, the characteristics that each individual had laid out. And we started to put them all together on a wall, and we started to see some very common themes like autonomy and transparency. Everyone wanted information shared as soon as it came in so they could be autonomous and make informed decisions. After all of that information gathering and a few other steps, what it led to at the end was they together put together a set of operating guidelines that they wanted to be held accountable to after understanding where they were and what their vision was for a well-functioning team. What I used from a sociocracy perspective that I felt really worked really well, and I'm really glad I knew about, was rounds of consent. Throughout the entire day, we used rounds of consent to make sure that no one was left behind and everyone was brought along on their journey. And at the very end, when they had together defined the operating guidelines, we did rounds of consent to make sure that each individual consented to being held accountable to that set of operating guidelines. And what we were trying to do, or what I was trying to do, was I was trying to look for objections to understand where people weren't comfortable. Because then we needed to understand, we needed to really dig a little bit deeper, understand why they objected. And generally that led to one of two outcomes. Either the guidelines were tweaked to find a common middle ground, or more commonly what actually happened was we found that through reframing things, we could actually find that they were actually comfortable. They had just been seeing things in a different way to the rest of the team. So summarizing that one, what really came in really handy in this conflict resolution workshop from a sociocracy perspective was the idea of rounds and consent and nonviolent communication to allow people to express themselves in a way that they feel comfortable expressing their feelings and why they feel the way they do. I'm going to stop talking for a minute. Any questions or comments or different views? No? Okay. Final slide, and this one's just a bit more of an open one. So as a consultant, we came across two different types of organizations generally. What we were trying to do, our mission as a consultancy was to help companies or our clients deliver better software faster. And as you can imagine, that's not just changing their IT department, that's a systemic change about how they operate as an organization. Generally, the metric of how quick an organization operates is how quickly they can make decisions. The two kind of types of companies that we came into contact with was hierarchical organizations and flatter organizations. The hierarchical organizations tend, but not always, tend to be a little bit slower at making decisions because they centralize the decision making. So if someone wants to make a decision who's in a situation, it needs to tend to go, they need to wait for a decision to be made for them to be able to proceed. And a possible negative outcome of that is the people who are making the decision know less about the context than the person who's actually in the situation. So it can lead to the wrong or a less informed decision being made, but not always. And flatter organizations have a different problem, which is really interesting, which is flatter organizations, they can make decisions more quickly because generally the people on the edges of the organization who are actually in the situation can make the decision themselves. But if information isn't being disseminated across the organization in an effective manner, then they may not have all the context they need to make and more informed decision. Hierarchies, whilst maybe slowing decision-making in some cases, offers a way of diffusing information across the organization. And without a hierarchy, you can be in trouble unless you account for that. So the things that we were thinking about for those flatter organizations that were having trouble with information dissemination was, hey, well, sociocracy is a really nice way of doing this. You have circles, and those circles are interlinked, and you have these really nice way of ensuring that accurate information is disseminated in the right direction across the organizations. We got to the point of thinking about it, and then I was no longer there. I left at the end of December, but that was a really interesting path that we were going down. I see someone's said something, so I'm just going to have a quick look, but I'm also interested in any questions at this stage or any comments. While you're doing this, thank you, Elle. While you're doing the rounds, are you recording participants' answers on a whiteboard? That's a good question. While we're doing the rounds, so was this, Elle, please speak up, was this the rounds of consent, or was this the cathartic rounds, or what were you thinking?
Yeah, both. So the cathartic rounds, or yeah, and when they're actually putting forward ideas for what they think is characteristics of a good team. So yeah, are you recording their answers as like a brainstorming list, and so they can actually see that they're bringing forward the solutions themselves from themselves?
Good question. So with the rounds of consent, so with the cathartic round, they had a post-it each, and they had like a green and a red, and on the red they wrote the negative one, and on the green one they wrote the positive one. And as we did the round, they would explain one, and then explain why they felt that way. And that wasn't recorded, but they had the post-it. And then we went around and we did the other feeling, and that was the same format. So the post-its were notional. They didn't really mean anything, but there was some recording in a way. And then I played it back to them saying, hey, this is really interesting. This is the pattern that I read as you explain this to me. What do you think? And there were some eyebrows and movements and things like that. When it came to the rounds of consent, everyone consented all the way through, except in the last round when 3 out of 10 people objected. And that's when I started to dig in and say, okay, well, what would need to change to help you feel comfortable? And there wasn't any recording there, because it was just slowly kind of trying to push back any concerns until there weren't any concerns left. And what I found was actually I didn't need to talk much, because 7 out of 10 people were in agreement. The 3 out of 10 people that weren't in agreement quickly evaporated as the rest of the team tried to help that person share the same view of the world as they did. So they tried to say, actually, I see things differently. This is how I see things. How does that make you feel? And they did all the talking, and I just shut up, because we started to get a majority, and it's kind of started to be self-perpetuating. We had people from both consultancies kind of convincing each other. So Denise, in terms of the individual exercises where they were kind of framing what does a well-functioning team look like? That was mainly post-its and clustering on a wall. And I realize I'm running out of time, but I'll be very happy to talk about it offline if you find it interesting. I've even got a slide deck, so we can practice it together if you'd like. Hope that helps.
Can I chime in with a thought on that?
Sir?
Can I chime in with a thought on that?
Yeah, please can.
So I think there's a caution about recording things, that recording makes them more permanent. So if your objective is to gather ideas and you want them to be permanent or held, then it makes sense to record them. But if you're working through conflict, there is a moment when what you really want is for people to change their perspectives, and writing down what they said is not going to help them do that. So I think being clear about goals and objectives and what your intention in the round is would help inform a decision.
I really like that. Yeah, that really resounds. The only thing that we did write down at the end that was permanent, you're absolutely right, it was what are the operating principles that you've come up with? And so they'd worked in pairs to define them, and I just copied them all down, put them on a screen in front of everyone and said, okay, let's do a round of consent to see if you can consent to be held accountable to that. So you're absolutely right. That's really nice, and I hadn't thought about that, but that just makes so much sense. Thank you for sharing.
Thank you.
Denise, how do people first react to consent and rounds in more traditional companies? Did it have an effect on cohesion and safety? That's really interesting. So the other consultancy that we were dealing with was a very traditional hierarchical organization. So the implicit rounds at the beginning as a check-in, obviously that was kind of done under disguise on the sly, as they didn't notice that. In terms of me very strongly facilitating them to do rounds, they were actually very open to that. They understood, and I'm trying to think if I had to explain anything to them, but they all seemed very open to it. I think what really helped was the fact that at the very beginning in the cathartic round, they realized that they had the same shared objective. And when they had that, they policed themselves because they realized that it was in their interest to go along with this workshop because they're all feeling frustrated and they're all excited and all wanted to reach a positive outcome. So they kind of policed themselves. One or two times, actually, I had my colleagues come out of the room saying, "Oh, Simon, I'm feeling really frustrated." Oh. And they kind of then let that out on me rather than letting that out in the room because they trusted me and they knew me. And they knew that speaking out loud like that in the room would be counterproductive. And so I found that very positive, that they were able to handle their feelings and in a constructive way. And no, I think everyone in the room felt cohesion and safety. But I think the one thing that I did feel was this was just, and it's probably very clear, is that this was one step in resolving conflict. It was the first step. And with resolving conflict, it needs to be a longer intervention where you have this as one of many checkpoints along the way. So yeah, I hope that helps, Denise. I'm open to other questions. I realize we've got another 3-4 minutes. Thanks for having me.